I'm 100 years old. I was born in 1921 in Bern, Indiana, and I graduated from Bern High School in 1939, and then they tore the building down after that. And then I decided I didn't know what I wanted to do. There wasn't much for women at that time except secretaries and so forth, and we had our senior class took a trip to Riley Hospital in Indianapolis, and we went through the children's ward, and I said, that's it. I came home and I told my parents, I said, I know what I want to do. I want to be a nurse. So I had to earn money. I worked at one of the restaurants. I washed dishes and made salads for $1 a day. Boy, that was big money. And I saved all that, and I was able to make my first year's tuition with the money that I made. So in 1940, I went to the Lutheran Hospital School of Nursing and graduated in 1943. Now, I can tell you how I learned about Pearl Harbor. We were in class, and someone came running in with a radio, or told us to turn on the radio, and they said the Japs were bombing Pearl Harbor. And I said, well, where's Pearl Harbor? Nobody knew where Pearl Harbor was. And we listened to that. We were spellbound. And that triggered me. And I thought, I want to help the war effort. But I couldn't until after I graduated. So in 1944, I enlisted. I went to Bearfield, and I was accepted. And I went down they sent us to Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indianapolis for basic training. If you can imagine nurses taking basic training, we were greener than grass. And anyway, they had we were supposed to join a parade. We were supposed to get in line and be in the parade around the complex. But it started raining, and we broke ranks and ran to the barracks, and boy, did we get reamed out by the chief nurse. You don't do that. Well, that was just one of we weren't very GI. So from there, I got orders to go to the Ashford General Hospital, which was located in West Virginia, White Sulphur Springs, and it was the Greenbrier Hotel that was a very, very famous resort for presidents. They would come there for the sulfur springs, and it was built in the 1800s, and it was a gorgeous place. It had velvet curtains and beautiful surroundings. Besides, it had 3 golf courses. And anyway, that's where I had my first tour of duty, was there at Ashford General Hospital. And I was there for about 10 months. And I got into trouble because I wasn't very GI. And one evening, I was taking care of patients, and one of them was very seriously ill, and And I sat down on the bed beside him and held his hand and tried to console him. And the officer of the day came around and caught me and reported me to the chief nurse. Well, that was a no-no. And I said, well, in that case, maybe I should move on. And she says, I think that's a good idea. But at that place, we worked 10 hours a day, sometimes 12. We had a weekend off a month and 1 day off a month. And that's where I learned to play golf, because I had that day off and we could go out on the golf course and shoot and hit balls and so forth. And to this day, I was on a team in Fort Wayne, and I played quite a bit of golf in my lifetime. I wanted to go back. At Ashford General, they had troop trains coming in with wounded from New York and New Jersey and places like that, and we would take care of the wounded. I had a ward of paraplegic patients who were paralyzed from the waist down, and at that time we didn't have the technique or the knowledge to treat them. I can remember my first shot of penicillin that I gave. Before, we had just sulfa to treat the wounds. But we would transfer these patients to their various homes across the states, because that was kind of a transition place. So then they cut orders for me to go overseas, and ended up in New Jersey and New York, and I have a picture of, there were 200 nurses boarding the Ile-de-France ship. It was a luxury ship, but it was turned into a troop ship. And there were 6 of us in a stateroom. We had just bunks, and we had to keep our life vests with us all the time. And several of the girls got so seasick, but I didn't. And we had submarine drills, and in fact, one during the night, the whistles started, and we had to get out on deck. They had sighted a German submarine, but we were okay. They didn't attack us. So from there I landed in Scotland, and it was so great to get on land. We boarded a troop train, and it took us 3 days to get down to England. I had 3 brothers, and they were all in the service. My oldest brother was stationed in Norwich, England, with the 8th Air Force. He was a bombardier. And my second brother, Gaylord, he was shipped to the South Pacific and ended up in Japan. And my youngest brother, Wayne, did not go overseas, but he was stationed in San Francisco. And my parents had 4-star flag in the window, because all 4 of us were in the service at the same time. While I was in England, I got word that my oldest brother was getting married to one of the English girls who was a pilot. And anyway, they became engaged, and they wanted to get married. So he got hold of, somehow he knew I was in England, and he asked me to come to the wedding. So I asked the chief nurse if I could get an R&R, which is rest and recreation. And she said, sure. Well, I was pretty green trying to get around in London, so she sent another gal with me who was just as green as I was. Anyway, we boarded the train in London and got to Norwich, and my brother met us. And to make a long story short, we were walking down the street. I wanted to talk to him. I wanted to communicate with him and find out just what was going on. And I mean, after all, he was my brother. And the MP stopped us. He was a staff sergeant, and I was a lieutenant. And they accused us of fraternizing and were going to turn us in. But we got our dog tags out, we got our information out that showed that we were brother and sister. So he said, okay, if you want to come to the reception, he invited them to the reception. But at that time, I don't know if you've ever heard of fish and chips, but that's what the English had plenty of, and that's what we had to eat at the reception was fish and chips. We worked in the hospital just for a couple months in England, and then we went to France and was stationed in Reims, France. By that time, there was VE Day. The war had ended in England and France and Germany, but the troops were coming back. And in France, we were at a mess hall, and we were on route. And as I was sitting on the end of a truck, and somebody yelled at me, Eileen. Here it was my cousin from Bern.
Wow.
Wow, he was just coming back from the front. I was going the other way, and we couldn't eat because we were too excited. But imagine meeting your cousin in France. And so from France, I got orders to go to Germany. And we went to an airfield. It was a B-17, and they weren't equipped to haul passengers. Most of them were fire planes, but we had benches, and there were 6 of us, 6 nurses on this, and we got off, and as we were flying over the Alps, the pilot asked me to come up and sit in the co-pilot seat if I wanted to, which I did. So I sat in the co-pilot seat, and we crossed the Alps, and it was a beautiful sight. And we landed in Frankfurt. And from Frankfurt, we took a truck to Bad Mergentheim, which was north of Frankfurt, and it had been a TB hospital at one time. So this was called the 138th Evac Hospital, and this is where we treated the wounded that was coming back, that were still in Germany, and also there was an Air Force base not too far from us, and we treated patients from them if they needed it. And that's where I spent most of the time. I remember I worked post-op for a while, and I remember one young man who had so many injuries, and I was starting a blood transfusion on him, and and it after in a day or so he passed away. He just couldn't make it. But if we'd have just had the expertise and the knowledge that they have now, we could have saved so many. It was heartbreaking. I don't want to brag, but I got to tell you something. I wasn't very GI. I was very friendly with the patients, and I had a furlough for a week, and I went home to Bern. And one day the phone rang. I answered it. And they said, "Is your mother there?" I says, "Yes." "We want to speak to her." And I thought, what? What do they want to talk to my mother about? They wanted to tell her how much they appreciated me.
Oh, wow.
So, and they were boys on the ward that I would take care of, and as I said, I wasn't very GI.
And you say you weren't very GI, but what it sounds like to me is that you were just compassionate.
I was a nurse. I was compassionate, and when you're dealing with fellow soldiers and young men with injuries, I mean, you're a nurse first and an officer second. I got orders. I had enough points to come home, but in the meantime, they sent a crew, which I was a member, to Marseille, France. We were supposed to go to South Pacific because the war was still going on, and we were being sent to the South Pacific. But VJ Day came, and what a celebration we had! Oh, it was great. And so they thought, well, what are we going to do with these nurses? And I saw a notice on the bulletin board in the barracks that they wanted nurses to take care of the nursery, the babies on a ship that was carrying 200 war brides back to the States, and they had a nursery with 50 babies. They needed a volunteer, and boy, I volunteered because I was going back to all through the time I was overseas. We did not have fresh vegetables. We did not have good meat. It was spam. If we had a party, well, it was a way of trying to take care of the spam in other ways. But no fresh vegetables, no fresh fruit. It was everything canned and powdered eggs. Anyway, got on that ship and we had vegetables, green leafy vegetables and fruit and good meat. So it took us several days to get back to New York, and in the meantime I worked in the nursery, crossing the English Channel. It was so choppy, everybody got seasick. But we landed in New York, and I went to Fort Dix, and I had to have a physical, make sure everything was okay. And they said, "Would you like to volunteer for another term?" And I said, "Oh no, I want to go home." So I got on a train, came to Fort Wayne. That's when Fort Wayne still had trains. And called my aunt, who lived in Fort Wayne, and I got a taxi to go see, to take my bags and went to her place, and then we called my folks in Bern. My dad was at that time working at Zollner the Zollner company there in Fort Wayne, and my mother and my oldest brother Les, who was home by that time, came and got me, and we stopped at Zollner plant, and they got my dad out, and I could give him a hug. Then I went home. I was lost. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was tired. I said I didn't want to do any more nursing. From a very restricted lifestyle to go home, and it was hard. It was hard to adapt. So my brother, who owned the Palmer House at that time in Bern, asked me to come and work for him. I lasted 2 weeks. I decided nursing was pretty good. So then I applied at my old school of nursing, which was Lutheran, and they had a vacancy in surgery, and so I worked in surgery for a year, and then went on the floor and did nursing on the floor. When we went home, we didn't talk. I didn't tell you how I met my husband.
A military man, right?
Yes, he was in service for 5 years. He was in the Air Force, and he was stationed also in Norwich, England. And he, anyway, I met him after I got home. It was quite an interesting story. His grandfather was a janitor there at the Lutheran Hospital, and he came up. I always kidded him a lot. He came up to me and he says, "You know, I have a nephew that needs a girlfriend." I says, "Oh, send him around, you know." 2 days later, he comes to me and he says, "We're having supper, and you're going to come, and you're going to meet my nephew." I met his nephew, and I married him.
Pretty good. Matchmaker, huh?
Yeah, that was, and so that was, but I had no idea that when I'm 100 years old that something like this would be going on. I didn't expect to live this long. But God has been good to me. It was in 2014. I went on the honor flight. Well, to begin with, there was the honor flight that started in Decatur. I forget the gentleman who started it. Anyway, they could take 19 veterans, and I was number 20, so I didn't get to go, and that was great. And then in 2014, Kathy Berkshire insisted that I said, "I'm not worthy of going on an honor flight. I didn't do anything great." "Yes, you're going to go." So she was my sponsor. And what a wonderful, wonderful experience. I'll never forget it. And Dennis Covert was my escort in Arlington. And he escorted me, and there were 2 in wheelchairs also behind me that went up to the tomb, but Dennis and I put the wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier. And then when they played taps, oh, the tears flew. I could hardly handle it. But that was such an honor, and I can't thank him enough. The honor flight is great. Anybody that has a chance to go on it, even as a sponsor, or they should go. It's unbelievably good. And then they have a building there. It's a women's history building, and they dropped us off there. There were 3 other nurses. One was from the Coast Guard. One was from the Army. 3 of us were from the Army, and the one of the nurses, she was older than I was yet. Her grandson, who lived in Phoenix, he was in the service. He flew and surprised her. He came in with his uniform on and with the books. We each got a book with our history in it. And that was amazing. That was just amazing. You know, there was a time that our country was torn apart with this war, but we all, those of us that came home, we did not dwell on it. We came home, and the things at that time were so scarce. We had to go on. We had to put our name on a list to get a refrigerator, a stove, or anything like that. But we didn't talk about it. We went ahead and started a family, and my children said they found out more after I've been interviewed but my husband and I never talked about it. We went ahead and got on with our lives, and I think most of our generation did that. That's why they call it the greatest generation, and I agree with that wholeheartedly.